Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the British Columbia Museums Association webinar. My name is Anissa Paulson, and I will be your host for today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the BCMA offices are located on the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and learn here in mutual respect and appreciation. We also recognize the traditional lands of the many nations across British Columbia and Alberta, where the research described in this webinar has been carried out. Today's webinar topic is Deaccessioning and Disposition of Collections, Ethical and Legal Issues. Today we are pleased to have with us Meaghan Patterson, who is the Executive Director of the Alberta Museums Association, and Sandra Morton Weizman, who is the Project Manager for the Alberta Museums Association's recent research project on deaccessioning. And both Meaghan and Sandra will be providing some additional background on their recent research project, but we're very excited to have them here with us today to present their research findings. They were both presenting at the recent Alberta Museums Association conference, and those of us in BC today are really excited to hear the results of your research again. The webinar series is sponsored by Lucidia, and we thank Lucidia very much for their ongoing sponsorship of our webinar series. As I mentioned, I am Anissa Paulson, your host for today. I'm also BCMA's program officer. If you're having any technical difficulties, please call the office at 250-356-5700 or send me a text, and I will try to help you work through your technical difficulties. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you're reading the slide and hearing me talk, you are doing great. And if not, again, please try to call our office or send us a text. Throughout the webinar, we welcome your questions and comments, and please feel free to use the chat button. It is located in your menu bar, which sometimes can be hidden. So if you scroll your mouse to the, or if you hold your mouse at the top or the bottom of your screen, the feature menu should generally appear. And then you can type in your chat. I will be monitoring the chat room during the presentation, and we'll be able to read your comments or questions out to both Meaghan and Sandra for them to answer. They have a lot of great information for us today, so we expect this webinar to take the full hour. Okay, so this month's presenters are Meaghan Patterson and Sandra Morton Weizman. Meaghan Patterson has been the Executive Director and CEO of the Alberta Museums Association since 2014 and has overseen several innovative projects, including the Museum Flood Funding Program and the AMA's Sustainability and Climate Change initiatives. Meaghan's work focuses on creating opportunities for museums of all types to thrive and to challenge traditional ways of thinking. She is passionate about the role museums can play in society and the importance of building capacity for long-term sustainability and positive change in communities. Sandra has been working in the museum and heritage field for over 35 years. She holds an MA in Canadian History and a Master in Museum Studies, both from the University of Toronto. She has previously worked in a wide variety of positions across Canada and currently works as a museum and heritage consultant, specializing in exhibition planning, project management, curation, collections management, and policy writing and analysis. We are very pleased to have you both here with us today, as well as many of your Alberta Museum Association members. And I look forward to learning about your research. So now, over to you.
Okay. All right, well, thank you, Anissa, and I hope everyone can hear me here. This is Meaghan Patterson, the Executive Director of the Alberta Museums Association, and I'm happy to be providing this presentation with Sandra today. I just want to make sure that everything's working. Okay. So just to get started, so we undertook this project. Sorry, I'm having some technical issues here. There we go.
There you go.
Okay. So as Anissa mentioned, we undertook this project just over a bit of a year ago. So a little bit of history on that was that there was a group of museum professionals in Alberta who decided that there was an increasing need for better understanding of deaccessioning in museums, what this meant, and how it could be best undertaken. And so that group decided to come together and form a bit of a consortium of museum professionals that would investigate this issue a bit further. They came to the AMA and applied to our institutional grants partnership program, and were successful in receiving funding. And so it is a partnership project through the AMA grants program as opposed to an AMA-led project. However, the AMA did participate in some of the research that was done. And one of the driving forces, I guess, behind this group getting together was around the issue of items that were lost collections, if you could say, and a lack of understanding as to should items be deaccessioned from a museum, whether there were any legislative channels that would protect the public trust notion around the idea of museum collections. So this group is really looking into the fact that there was increased frequency of deaccessioning in the museum community, both isolated items as well as on larger scale. Obviously, due to some prominent deaccessioning that's happened across the country and in the United States in the recent past, there's an increasing public awareness of museum deaccessioning and the issues that presented when museums tend to undertake these projects. They felt there was some lack of clarity around transfer of ownership and a general need for additional resources for best practices around deaccessioning. And so that was kind of the motivating factor for why this project got off the ground. As I mentioned, it was a group of museum professionals from across the province of Alberta, and various different perspectives were involved. So the Alberta Museums Association, through its grant program, funded the research portion of the project. There was support from the Athabasca University Heritage Resources Management Program. There was a variety of museums, specifically collections management staff in many instances involved, from museums you can see on the screen, as well as other museum professionals across the province, and the research consultant, Sandra, who's presenting here with me today. So this group met several times, both in person and via conference call across the last year, to determine the scope and direction of the project, as well as to provide guidance and support to Sandra, the consultant, as she undertook this extensive research project. The results were presented to the committee over early summer and were disseminated at the Alberta Museums Association conference just last month, and now today to this webinar. So I'm now going to turn it over to Sandra, who is going to talk a little bit about the research method, the process, and what we really wanted to find out.
Okay, so the committee had some very specific questions, as Meaghan mentioned. They were looking for solutions to more overarching issues concerning museum ethics, legislation, and the public trust. To that extent, I embarked on a more extensive literature review, as well as designing a survey for AMA members and a series of interviews with stakeholders across Canada. The final report produced as part of the contract specifically addresses these questions and thorny issues that have arisen through the committee's discussions. And they are the sum of important issues that museums in Alberta are grappling with that relate to the subject of deaccessioning and dissolution of collections. The report is organized with each section addressing a different question committee members raised, such as deaccessioning as it relates to natural disasters, repatriation, orphaned and abandoned collections, contraventions of museum ethics, and other topics. As the BCMA was very excited to learn of our research project, they asked to be included and have our survey disseminated to their membership as well as our own. And the biggest issue that arose from the surveys was looking at the idea of legislation concerning orphaned or found in collections properties. And this request was put forth by several museum respondents from both Alberta and BC. In addition, just to go over who was interviewed. Direct follow-up was done to a few of the survey respondents about their submissions. There were also telephone interviews and email correspondence with various Museums Association staff across Canada, the Canada Revenue Agency, the Canadian Association of Chartered Accountants, legal experts, academics with expertise in museum ethics, municipal museum administrators, curators, collections managers who are currently or have recently undergone major deaccessioning projects, museum repatriation officers, collections registrars, former museum workers whose museums have gone through dissolution, retired museum professionals, and others. Discussions were also held with various provincial and territorial museums associations. And it's important to note that while some museums associations or government departments responsible for funding museums have developed standards for best practice, very few have tied meeting these standards to operating funding. So in other words, standards are recommended, but in most parts of Canada, there's no penalty regarding funding if these standards are not met or adhered to. So from the survey itself, some of the respondents suggested that the CMA Code of Ethics proves difficult to follow, and that one of the examples given was that they recommend museums give 3 months notice to the public before disposing of objects from their collections. The concern was that for small local history museums, there would be a public backlash if they announced 3 months in advance that they would be disposing of artifacts from local donors. Respondents also wanted to see more training offered to small museums in terms of how to create policies and procedures to bring them in line with the various codes of ethics, given their perception was that codes of ethics are oriented more towards professionals from larger museums. And there was also a concern expressed that the amount of documentation recommended in the AMA Standard Practices Handbook was too onerous for small volunteer-run or minimally staffed museums to carry out. And a need for more concise and practical policies.
Okay. So now we're going to dive into some of those topics that Sandra mentioned that came up as the most pressing, either by the committee members or as a result of the interviews and surveys that were conducted. And the first one that we're going to talk about is deaccessioning in instances of natural disasters or emergency situations. So the AMA has done quite a bit of work with museums who have experienced disasters over the last 5 or 6 years or so. As coming out of the floods of 2013, the AMA had the opportunity to work with the government and provide the museum flood funding program to those museums who were affected or potentially affected by flooding or emergency situations. And so we've had a bit of experience in helping people work through the recovery process coming out of experiencing a natural disaster, and have been able to develop some resources that kind of assist with should that situation occur again at another institution. So one of our committee members obviously was greatly affected by the flooding in 2013, and so spoke to the fact that deaccessioning in these sorts of instances is a unique situation. Obviously, damage can be incredibly extensive. Deaccessioning can, as a result, be quite rapid and at large scale, and circumstances can often be beyond your control, whether you can even gain access to your site for immediately following the disaster situation, or whether for other safety reasons you're kept away, and so any disaster management plan that you may have developed might need to be altered in the moment. And so because of that experience and the research that Sandra conducted around deaccessioning in emergency situations, there were some recommendations around what kinds of resources would be either required or wanted by museum professionals in these instances. So there was a recommendation within the report that museums investigate the possibility of having separate criteria for deaccessioning in disaster situations where damage is incredibly extensive. the AMA has developed a resource for preparing for emergency situations such as the ones that were experienced in 2013. And we do have our Help Emergency Response Manual or Emergency Preparedness Manual for museums that includes a variety of tools and resources to help museums prepare their disaster response plans and collections management plans, so that should they find themselves needing to do massive deaccessioning, that there is a plan that hopefully can work for them. In addition to the manual itself, we do have an accompanying workshop in which instructors will help museums work through the development of an emergency response plan and tailor it to the unique situations that they have at their institutions. And we have also since incorporated emergency response as a mandatory piece of our accreditation program, the Recognized Museum Program. Another recommendation with regards to natural disasters was to make sure that museum storage is well documented, and that it is known where the most important or valuable items are within the collection storage space, so that they can be easily identified and removed should the case be necessary. Another topic that came up in the course of the research that was, again, a little bit, I suppose, unique, was around deaccessioning and dissolution. Obviously, this kind of deaccessioning comes with complex challenges. And the AMA ensures that it's working with museums at all stages of their organizational life. And so obviously that sometimes means that we are working with museums who are considering going through closure, or who are actively going through closure. We have noticed, as we're seeing demographic shifts, that we are seeing an increasing number of museums that are either contemplating this or actively going through it. We've also realized that there's not a whole lot of resources available out there for people who are going through closure and all of the associated processes that go along with doing that properly, deaccessioning just being one of those pieces. But what we have learned so far is that having a collections management policy that aligns with bylaws in terms of what is to happen to your collection should you face closure is incredibly important. We have heard of a number of cases where current museum staff and volunteers believe that the collection is to go to another like institution, but that receiving institution is not necessarily aware that it should be anticipating additional collections items should their neighboring museum need to close down. And so because of that, you should also really have a comprehensive dissolution policy within your museum. When going through a closure process, it's really important to ensure that you have strong community engagement, so that there's that public awareness piece around the museum collection, and the public trust element, and where that collection is to go upon closure, so that there is less risk with it kind of not following due process when it comes to best practice for deaccessioning. And obviously, if a museum is going through closure, ensuring that you're preparing for the emotional response of staff and volunteers who have, in all likelihood, dedicated many hours and years to the care and of that collection over time. In terms of what resources are available or needed when it comes to deaccessioning due to dissolution, as I mentioned, the report does recommend increased resources with regards to this particular area. And the AMA is currently working to write up case studies and best practices that'll accompany a larger resource around museum life cycle and the different stages that museums go to. So that's something that the AMA is actively working on now, my apologies, with a few case museums in Alberta, and so will be forthcoming in the nearer future. Obviously, if there's not a lot of formal written resources available at the moment, reaching out to peers for lived experiences, modeling best practice on what we know has worked with other sites, and being increasingly transparent about that work is really important as museums go through closure. There are several other recommendations within the report that Sandra will now speak to.
Yeah, so one of the questions that arose the most frequently, both in the survey as well as from our committee members, was how should museums handle unidentified collections dropped off at their doors? So it's our recommendation that museums should not accession such items into their collection and should never assign numbers to said objects unless they choose to keep those items, which may occur in exceptional circumstances. Museums may dispose of such items as they see fit, provided that this information is stated in the museum's collections policy. Museums should state on their temporary receipt forms that such objects may be disposed of within 90 days if there is no accompanying contact information left with whatever has been abandoned at their doorstep. Especially for museums that don't have a website, but even if they do, a notice should be posted in a prominent place on the museum, well, on the website, but also near the museum's entrance. If there is no website, the notice should be displayed near the museum entrance detailing its policy concerning abandoned objects. Community museums, especially here in Alberta, should consider adopting a similar policy to that of the Collections Management Policy of Alberta Culture Heritage Division from the Government of Alberta that was published in 2014 and is available online for the general public. Then another question that came up very frequently is how should museums handle orphan collections, or what's referred to as found in collection items? So found in collection items are things that have been sitting in the museum for a long time, as opposed to abandoned on your doorstep. The provenance is unknown. It may have been accessioned but not entered into the database. It may be disassociated from its gift form or number. It may have been taken in by a volunteer or worker at some point, but never processed, left as a potential donation. The potential donor may have been notified that it was not eligible for accessioning, but was never picked up. Or it may be an item that was loaned for a temporary exhibition and was never picked up by the artist or owner. Sometimes the contact information is not correct. Sometimes the person just never came back to pick it up because they really don't want it back. And or the museum may not have the resources to return it. All of this may have been undocumented and forgotten for decades. So this is the single issue over which survey respondents expressed a desire for legislation. Again, the Government of Alberta Collections Management Policy addresses this issue. However, there's no current legislation to back it up. Several museum managers I spoke with in Ontario that were interviewed for the study spoke of the exact same issue regarding this lack of legislation. According to the ARCS, American Association of Registrars and Collection Specialists, there are only 5 states in the US that do not have any form of legislation concerning this matter. And they recommended that that in terms of dealing with objects found in the collection without documentation or that have been abandoned, the common law requires the museum to make a reasonable good faith effort to find the lender or owner before the ownership of the object is converted. The legal term conversion means the assumption of ownership of property that previously belonged to someone else. Reasonable good faith efforts include sending a certified letter to the last known address of the owner, if you know who the owner or lender was, publishing a legal notice in a local newspaper with a date for the resolution of the situation. And this chart that you see here was originally from the American Alliance of Museums, but it's been reproduced by the Museum Association of Saskatchewan in a tip sheet that they've produced on found in collections. And we've appended it in our appendices with the report. And they suggest that such collections are best addressed on an individual case-by-case basis. Once a museum determines that there are no records or people who remember who brought the collection in question into the museum, and that the museum does not wish to retain such items, it is recommended that such objects be documented thoroughly and that all information be retained on file for the museum's internal use. Such items may then be transferred to other public collections, sold at public auction, or disposed of with witnesses present if appropriate. Museums Association of Saskatchewan cautions museums to exercise greater caution when dealing with artifacts of Indigenous origin, artifacts containing organic materials that may require unique disposal methods, or artifacts that could potentially endanger staff or the permanent collection, in which cases more expeditious decision-making is warranted. Now I'm going to move on to the subject of gift forms. So something else that's come up is just how to make your gift agreements reflect the reality of your museum collection mandate and how to manage donor expectations. So increasingly, it's being recommended that museums not state in their gift forms that the object will remain in the museum's collection in perpetuity. Instead, the wording should include the explicit statement that the museum has the right to do with the object as it sees fit, with no restrictions. There are many reasons why a museum may wish to deaccession the objects in question at some future date, such as change of mission, better examples with better provenance, it's become a safety hazard, etc. The most oft-repeated advice from seasoned museum administrators is not to accept donations that do not strictly fit the museum's mandate and collecting rationale. As museums tighten up policies in this regard, deaccessioning may become more related to collecting from the museum's earlier history. Okay, then we'll go on to the CRA ruling now. We'll stay there. Sorry, deaccessioning of art by living artists is the next topic now. Okay, so something else that has come up is that conventions differ for works of art by living artists. So while the CRA is clear with regard to rulings over the return of deaccession artifacts to donors, which I'm going to talk about next, the practice is quite different for art banks or public galleries of contemporary art. And in these cases, where more of the collections have been built through purchase rather than donation, purchased works of art from the artists are always offered back to the original artist or their estate before another mode of disposal is pursued, or they should be. One survey respondent recommended more clarification and detail about the differences between the various types of collections in codes of ethics and standard practices handbooks. A perusal of CARFAC, the Canadian Artists Representation, CARFAC Alberta's best practices for visual artists in Alberta. Their section on deaccessioning has this wording. Deaccessioning of work in a public collection by a living artist should be avoided. Where deaccessioning is deemed to be unavoidable, the artist should be informed of the decision and the gallery's policy. The artist should be offered right of first refusal in the event of deaccessioning of the artist's work by a public institution. And so our recommendations are that we align museum policies and codes of ethic guidelines with those cited by CARFAC, and CARFAC Alberta would be the same as, I'm sure, CARFAC BC, CARFAC Saskatchewan, and so on. And now we'll go on to CRA ruling for just a moment here. So I actually spoke to the charitable sector of the CRA, and one of the things, one of the questions that had come up was why, generally speaking, in museum codes of ethics and standard practice handbooks, why does it state that artifacts, when they're deaccessioned, should not be offered back to the original donor, even when there's no tax receipt issued? And that was something that I had wondered about, but it actually is a CRA ruling that if you donate something to the charitable sector, it must remain in the charitable sector, even if there was no tax receipt issued. So the object may be transferred to another charitable organization, like say from a museum to an educational institution, a university collection, a municipal museum that's not governed by the charitable sector, that kind of thing, but not back to the donor. However, if the objects are eventually placed on public auction, the original donor may may be invited to bid on it with anyone else. Okay. Tax reporting. Yeah, there is actually a handbook of the Canadian Institute for Chartered Accountants, and you have to be a member of that institute in order to access the handbook. It's now just an online version, with a code or password to gain access to. But we have as an appendix with the report the actual section 4441, which governs collections held by not-for-profit organizations, and it actually discusses deaccessioning and disposal of works of art or museum artifacts. And the guidelines very much align with museum ethics of using the proceeds from deaccessioning only for acquisitions and for collections management purposes, and not for operating or other purposes. And when you access, or when you get a copy of the report, that you'll be able to read it in depth.
Okay, so as Sandra's been mentioning the last few moments here, at the conclusion of the significant amount of research that Sandra conducted for the report and for the committee, several recommendations were put forward, and the recommendations were divided between those that the committee felt could or should be undertaken by the Alberta Museums Association, and those that could or should be taken up by either individual museums, museum professionals, or the museum sector on its own outside of the work of the association. So I'm just going to speak briefly to a few of the recommendations that were directed at the AMA specifically. The first two really that are listed on this slide are somewhat already in process or available. And so many of the survey respondents, committee members, interviewees felt that while the AMA did have a series of resources that were already available to the membership and the greater museum community, that there was the potential to make them more accessible to a wider variety of those working in the museum community. So one recommendation, as you'll see here, was to work with small museums to develop procedures that are accessible for those smaller museums. And so we do have our standard practices handbook, which touches on deaccessioning as part of collections management, as well as our deaccessioning specific resources and workshops, but that some institutions or individuals found that they still just weren't either easy to find on the website or accessible enough for a smaller institution to undertake. And that leads into the second piece, which is to increase the awareness of what pre-existing documents the AMA already does have that are available. And so we are already working on ways that we can increase the accessibility to those resources that we have. And so we're updating our checklists, our workshops, our documentation and guidelines, so that the language is such that anyone working in a museum can understand the rationale and the best practice behind what we're recommending for deaccessioning. And we're also in the process of reorganizing where that information sits on our website, so that anyone who's visiting our website and who isn't really familiar with how we organize our documentation will be able to find it without undue frustration. The third point is one that Sandra briefly touched on already, and that was around the CMA's Code of Ethics and the public awareness of deaccessioning and the stress that can cause museums, specifically in smaller communities where donors or families of previous donors are still residing and still very much tied to the institution. And so it has been recommended that the AMA develop either some guidelines or recommendations around communicating to public and stakeholders regarding deaccessioning. So really increasing that public awareness of the fact that deaccessioning is part of collections management and healthy collections management at an institution, that it is a normal process, and that there are a series of best practice guidelines that must be followed in order to ensure that museums are operating appropriately. So that should items come up for deaccession, it doesn't come as a shock to community members and have a potential to kind of damage those relationships within a community. So that was one of the kind of key messages for the AMA to undertake. And the last one that we've put here, again, I've talked about briefly already, is around developing resources for deaccessioning in instances of dissolution. As I mentioned previously, there are increasing instances where museums are considering or undertaking closure, and there's really no step-by-step or best practice guide for museums to follow as they undertake what can be an incredibly overwhelming and time-consuming process.
Okay, recommendations for the committee to consider. So considering pursuing legislation for abandoned property or found in collections items, that specifically found in collections items, that's something we are looking into. We're just, waiting right now on response from our members. And here in Alberta, the Galt Museum in Lethbridge their executive director will likely take the lead in that, and that will involve approaching their MLA for a private members bill. Ensuring museum practice aligns with the Societies Act and other relevant legislation. That's also something we've been looking into. And we have a situation in Alberta where, the museum ethics is one thing, but then the legislation with our Societies Act is not necessarily aligned with it. So for example, with our corporate registry's office, when I talk to them, if a museum wants to dissolve, or any organization, any nonprofit entity that's registered under the Societies Act, they must first pay off their debts by selling off all of their assets. And of course, the corporate registry's office doesn't differentiate between museum collections and assets, which could be office furniture. So that's another kind of gray area that we would like to see more specific criteria on how to follow the Societies Act recommendations without violating museum ethics. Working to ensure cultural export review board procedures are known and followed. This is also important in terms of any cultural property leaving the country when it shouldn't, that sort of thing, to ensure that those involved with making those decisions in their museums are aware of the laws around that. And also just the whole idea of never undertaking a major deaccessioning project at the same time as you're undertaking another huge project, such as building a new wing or an expansion to your museum. As deaccessioning is such a time-consuming process, if you or your staff do not have time to accession and catalog, they will never have the time to deaccession and dispose.
Okay, now just briefly before we open it up to questions for everyone, I just wanted to run through a few of the resources that the AMA has available to members and non-members alike, some of which I've already touched on throughout the course of this webinar. So we do have our Standard Practices Handbook, 3rd edition, which has a comprehensive section on collections management and a component of deaccessioning contained within. Our website also has freely available collections management policy templates, and that can be accessed and referenced by any member of the museum community, as well as gift agreement templates, an excerpt of which was included in this presentation here today. We also have our Help Emergency Preparedness Manual for Museums that deals with how to respond to emergency situations and natural disasters. And And part of that also includes some deaccessioning information, and it is full of templates and tearouts that are freely accessible as well and fillable from our website, should you want to look at those. We also have a deaccessioning checklist, so deaccessioning procedures checklist that helps walk people through what to consider when deaccessioning, when not to deaccessioning, and a kind of a step-by-step guide as to how you should undertake those projects, whether they be large or small. As I mentioned, that particular document is currently under revision to increase its accessibility by members from all institutions. We also have a set of tax accounting guidelines with regards to how you consider your collection on your financial statements. And as Sandra mentioned, should a museum enter into dissolution, and kind of how to work through understanding your collection as it relates to assets, should you have to go through a dissolution process. And we always have our advisory services, in which AMA staff are readily available to help people work through particular situations, to provide workshops or learning opportunities, or to answer any questions that people within the museum community may have with regards to collections management and deaccessioning.
And next steps. Well, as I already mentioned, we're gauging interest now in pursuing the abandoned property legislation, working with the community to see how to build awareness. And of course, the AMA is playing a major role in that. And in addition, we're recommending that museums planning to embark on a deaccessioning project are encouraged to discuss this with both the AMA and colleague institutions. Here in Alberta, there are several museums, both large government-run and small community museums, that have embarked on deaccessioning projects, both large-scale as well as, just pruning their collection on an annual basis, that kind of thing. And I'm sure in BC there are also many museums that have the expertise in this area, and it would be a good idea to talk to Anissa and the BCMA about who to be in contact with. And then the other recommendation is that Meaghan mentioned, the AMA will be developing more specific guidelines or a tip sheet regarding planning and procedures for communication and informing the public with regard to deaccessioning projects that museums are planning.
All right, so that concludes the formal piece of our presentation. So thank you very much for listening in and joining us today. And I believe I'm now going to turn it back over to Anissa, who will field any questions that you may have.
Yeah, thank you very much, Meaghan and Sandra. That was just a tremendous amount of research that you embarked on, and some really great issues that were brought up. None that I think are unique to Alberta. I think we are experiencing many of those same issues here in BC as well. So thanks for drawing our attention to all of those, and I appreciate all the work that your association has done in the past and will continue to do in the future to support the sector in this area. I look forward to perhaps collaborating on a few of those resources as well. We did have one question come in, and I encourage everybody else who is listening in right now to go ahead and type additional questions or comments or concerns that they may have in the chat box or in the Q&A box. The one question that we do have that I'll pose right now is, does first right of refusal to artists apply both to works of art donated and purchased from living artists, and works of art by living artists purchased and donated from collectors? I was wondering if either of you have a...
Okay, yeah, it's probably something I neglected to clarify, but when we talked about offering it back to the artist before deaccessioning it elsewhere, that's for purchase collections specifically, not for donated ones.
Okay. So hopefully that answered your question then. There's another question that just came through. When going through a deaccessioning process, is it standard practice to hold the item in a cooling off period after the decision has been made to deaccession? And if so, how long, or does it vary case by case?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by a cooling off period, but I think, you know, it has to go through whatever your steps are that, you know, according to your policy in your museum. So, you know, perhaps staff make the decision, but then it has to be approved usually by either a collections committee or the board of the museum, or, you know, or some other authority before it can be disposed of.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question that just popped in is somebody in a small museum who says they have approximately 2,500 items in their museum right now, which are from the local thrift shop. There's no provenance and there's no association with a family name. And they are wondering if they can deaccession these objects in bulk. I'm assuming that they are already accessioned into the collection and now they're asking to deaccession them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see a reason why not.
Yeah, and I think probably accessing your deaccessioning checklist might be a good next step for this particular museum, and making sure that whatever they do is in line with their current collections policy.
Right.
Yeah, I would recommend accessing that deaccessioning checklist. It's only, I believe it's a 3-page document, so it is fairly easy to digest. And so if you've got these objects that are from a local thrift shop, you have no provenance, you don't have any, you know, there's no donor information, then you would just follow your collections management policy and mandate in conjunction kind of with best practices for deaccessioning. And if it meets all of that criteria, like Sandra said, I don't see why you wouldn't be able to undertake a deaccessioning process for those items.
There's a question that I'm not able to answer, but maybe you guys know, or maybe even another webinar attendee might. Does the BC government have a legislation that applies to deaccessioning? And do you know, Sandra, at all?
Well, I know that I was waiting to see if someone else would answer, but I know that the registrar at the Royal BC Museum told me they have legislation that they follow, but I'm not clear if it's similar to the Government of Alberta collections management policy, you know, where it's policy developed by government, but that's not necessarily the same thing as legislation. However, I haven't looked into it in depth, what she was referring to, so I can't say for sure, but I suspect it's similar to what we have in Alberta.
Mm-hmm. And I can do some research into that as well, since it's specific to BC, and I'll try to get back to the person who answered that question, as well as
just to add to that, like I was in touch with Glenn Bloom, who's considered the legal authority on deaccessioning in Canada. He's based in Ottawa, and he told me there is no such legislation in Canada.
Okay, good to know. Yeah, the as you said, the information from the registrar may just be policy particular to the Royal BC Museum.
Well, I think it was beyond that, like similar to Alberta, it governed all, or it governs all Alberta government-run museums. So, you know, I think it's similar to that, but, you know, beyond just one museum, but still not, that doesn't mean the same thing as legislation.
Okay, so there's a question that came in that's an easy one to answer. Is a copy of this presentation going to be made available? That is yes. We do make a recording of all of our webinars, and they are free and available to all of our BCMA members through the member portal. But for anybody who has registered for this webinar, we will be sending out the direct link to the recording. So if people happen to miss it or caught part of it, the full webinar hour is being recorded right now, and I will send that out when it's available. And I'll also email out the report that Sandra and Meaghan mentioned, because again, this is a short amount of time to go through a really big topic. So I'll send out the report for everybody to have access to as well. Okay, a couple other questions are coming in. One is I have a piece of life-size folk art to deaccession, as it is a rendering of an Indigenous person made by a non-Indigenous person. And this item would be disposed of as it would not be acceptable into other collections. Can you recommend how to dispose of it?
Well, usually in that case, the procedure is to destroy it in front of witnesses.
Okay, thank you for that. Then another question is, we are working on examining gifts to municipal officials, and the regular rules of deaccessioning are not always easy to apply. For example, return to donor or sale or destruction. Are there any thoughts on acquisition or acceptance policies for gifts? So it sounds like gifts to municipal officials who then make their way into the museum's collection. If it's a municipally run museum.
Okay, yeah. Well, and these are is during that person's tenure or after they're long gone from it?
It doesn't specifically, oh, both.
Okay, yeah. Well, again, it depends on how your policies are worded, what you can do, right? And your gift forms, how they're worded.
So it might be more of an instance of looking at the acquisition policy around how those sorts of things are or are not accepted into the institution, so that it can kind of be framed from the get-go, so that either the deaccessioning can be done without kind of concern, or can be avoided, I suppose, from the get-go.
Another question is if past versions of a museum's gift agreement included an option for returning the item to the donor before staff were aware of the CRA ruling, for example, how should these items be handled if they are deaccessioned with a current policy that accounts for the CRA ruling?
Yeah, they legally cannot go back to the donor, but that is a very good question, and it is even some very major museums in Canada and their policy list giving it back to donors. I've been told that, but it actually is against the law.
So that sounds like perhaps checking in with the museum's legal counsel about that question. Is that something that they should be doing, or?
Well, I mean, I suppose they could, but it is against the CRA ruling. So I think, they have to explain that to the donor if it's an issue.
I think that would also come down to not only checking in with legal counsel as appropriate or necessary, but also around that strategic communications around deaccessioning and best practice, why it is the way it is, taking kind of a public relations approach to kind of stave off or avoid any backlash that might occur as museum standards of practice have evolved or whatnot over time.
Yeah, and this is, I think, a little bit along those lines, is how would you recommend posting a found in collection item for the public to identify in the local newspaper? You mentioned this as a recommendation, as a reasonable good faith effort when trying to identify found in collection items. And how would you do this and avoid public backlash at the same time? Do you have any advice for that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you could post a photo of it, describe it, ask, does anyone recollect this object, where it came from, can anyone claim it? It's, I mean, you could almost do it like a stumper question, make it like, I don't know, I would start that way, I think, as opposed to, notification that you're going to get rid of it if no one claims it. Like, I would start first asking, can anyone identify it, I think. And then if there's no response, then go, maybe in stages, how you would publicize what your plans are for that object or that collection.
And I think one thing that's been really noticeable or learned from large scale or high profile deaccessioning that's happened across the country in the last year or so is that transparency in around deaccessioning, around collections management is really vital to ensuring that you maintain strong relationships with your community members, whether they be donors or visitors, or other kinds of stakeholders and funders. I think transparency from the beginning can help avoid any sort of negative PR that might befall the museum should it appear that they are trying to dispose of things secretly.
Mm-hmm. Great.
That's very good advice. I think we just have time for the one last question here. And that is, do you have any thoughts about the disposal of trophies, which take up a lot of space and are not always relevant to our museum's mission?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be the same as any other type of collection. You know, if it's no longer relevant to your mission, or if you have too many of the same kind of thing, you know, you have your rationale as long as you have a clear collections policy and deaccessioning policy.
Okay, and then I'm sorry, I'm just gonna, one more just popped in and I'm just gonna quickly ask this as well. So in keeping with the CRA ruling, what happens when we have exhausted all of the other like-minded charitable museums during a deaccessioning process, and where do you go after?
Then you can either go on public auction. It's one option, or I suppose you could donate it to some other charitable organization.
That's not a museum.
Right, like if it's if a school maybe, or a university. I mean, again, this is based on the, you know, well, no, this is actually, I was going to say in Alberta, but no, it would be the same anywhere, yeah, in Canada. That would be okay with the CRA ruling. You know, I mean, perhaps there are things that teachers could use in an elementary school classroom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or even in an educational collection for your museum and
right, that too, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, well, we are, that was a very fast hour. So thank you both very much. I'm gonna try to get back to my screen here, and let's see here. Now over to you. Well done. Good questions, everybody. And thank you so much for weighing in on your advice, Meaghan and Sandra. I appreciate that. And again, for sharing this rich resource and all the reporting that you did. And also for pointing out the very great resources that you already have on your website. So I will be sending out a link to your website as well as to the BCMA's Brain, which is our online learning center for our members. And there are lots of free resources there, tools and tip sheets and things like that on a variety of subjects. We had been in the process of developing some particular tools and tip sheets and practical resources for specifically geared to small museums on the topic of deaccessioning, and those were on hold until this report came out. So look for those to be finalized and posted on the BCMA Brain in the months to come. So thank you very much, Meaghan and Sandra, for sharing your resources, your expertise, and your report. As a thank you, we will be infiltrating our BCMA swag into your AMA offices, and I'll send you both a BCMA mug next week. So look for that to arrive in your mailbox soon.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. And then for everybody else, feel free to join us next week. We are having a very special additional webinar on Wednesday, October 23rd, on the topic of exhibit panel design basics. And it's another tool for your exhibition development toolbox, again, specifically geared for people working in small community-based museums. So go ahead and register for that webinar, again, on the BCMA Brain. If you have any suggestions for topics or wish to present one for yourself, feel free to email me directly at grants@museumsassn.bc.ca. And then please go ahead and fill out our follow-up survey, which will be in your mailbox soon. So again, thank you all for joining us today on this day after Thanksgiving. And thanks again to Meaghan and Sandra for being with us today. I really appreciate it. And everybody, take care. We'll see you online again soon.